Thank you, Nisha, and thank you, Das, for inviting me to be part of this. The presentations by the interns were very, very interesting. So congratulations to the interns on doing a good job. Now, as always, I'm going to be talking from the perspective of a history person. And so while I understand and appreciate the connection, the emphasis on technology, on understanding the nature of current use, there are, I think, three aspects that I would like to also bring in. One is something that has been talked about for a while, which is that of community involvement. The issue over here is, I think, twofold. One is the issue of the communities themselves, as in, there are, this is something that has come out of some of my recent research on the weaving communities. Many of the youngsters are not interested in getting into the traditional areas at the moment. Somewhere we are falling short of emphasizing the involvement of the community in not just the technology, but also in the relevance of technology to livelihood. It is still taken for granted that technology is to do with medicine, engineering, but the what we used to call when many years ago community science is something that needs to be emphasized. What then is community science about? It is to do with, first, the knowledge, the accumulated knowledge of generations, the understanding to the current generation of the value of that knowledge, and therefore not in terms of a dead heritage, but of a continued living livelihood choice. That, I think, is the first area that we need to emphasize, because there is a phenomenal amount of knowledge that is available. I have talked on earlier occasions of the, well, we just had this last presentation on sedimentation. There was the last time I talked about how the community near one of the rivers in Tamil Nadu was talking about how silly it was to start dredging at high tide because it was self-defeating. If you think about it logically, it makes sense, because at high tide, the sediment is just going to rush back into the river. The other is a fact, again, talking of sedimentation, the fact that all of our rivers are so dammed that there is very little sediment coming down. What then happens to the underwater of those rivers? Khambat, the Gulf of Khambat, today has far less silting than it used to even 60 years ago. There was a time when it was said that the tidal bore of the Gulf of Khambat was what made sure that the Khambat area remained free of silt. Today, that bore is still there, but there is so much building that's happening that sedimentation is now moving further down the coast and blocking other areas. Older ports have had a problem, have had trouble. These are definitely aspects that need to be considered a lot more. Yet another dimension that needs to be understood is that of how we look at the idea of heritage. What defines heritage? Heritage is invariably seen as built heritage, but we need to remember that there is an intangible heritage which is equally important. By intangible heritage, I mean the awareness of the community of its own knowledge, of its own abilities, of its own engagements, and then the link between these engagements and multiple areas. Increasingly, maybe of late it's a little less, but still the tendency was very often to leave the community behind and carry on to the urban areas. And this is where I would come into port development. Today we are looking at ports. We are looking at a public-private engagement for ports, which we have been for a very long time. We are looking, again, for a very long time, we have been looking at special economic zones. What precisely do these provide to the communities around? Is there a connect with the communities that have engaged, or a total disconnect? These are questions that have not yet been raised. How does the community relate to what is happening around them? We have, of course, the case in a land-based case of the Sinner paper factory, and the way in which the community reacted to that, and to the ways in which, because of the involvement of the community, that factory was forced to shut down, and their concern was the pollution of the waters. At Krishnapatnam on the Andhra coast, there has been a problem with the fisher folk because, thanks to the development at that port, the water there became so polluted that the fisher folk did not manage to get a living. They then moved further south towards Chennai, and there were frequent conflicts between the Tamil Nadu fishermen and the Andhra Pradesh fishermen because of what they call poaching on the grounds. How does one address these issues? I understand and always do appreciate the need for development, but maritime security, maritime engagement, maritime power cannot be at the cost of community development. We need to have all of that going hand in hand. And that is where I think an engagement with the community becomes much more relevant. How do we engage with the community in terms of first knowledge, second, the valuing of that knowledge rather than the negation, third, the broader context of making this knowledge available across the board to a variety of people who are not engaged with this at all and who have by and large tended to dismiss this as knowledge. Let me take, for instance, the basic thing which all the naval people here will know, the idea of the compass rose and the wind roses. What is a compass rose? What is a wind rose? These are very easy terms to talk about, but who knows what they exactly mean? Why can it not be taught as part of the courses? I will go back actually to what Dr. Rao was saying, the need for greater studies that focus on maritime studies as a broad context. We tend to talk of maritime technology, maritime power, as maritime studies. Where, and here is where the history part of it comes in, where is the historical dimension? Who were the communities that traditionally engaged with these areas? Where is the mapping of the movement of these communities? Where is the mapping of the knowledge of these communities? None of this has happened. Moving beyond this, there is also a cultural context. We all know the temple bells and the church bells. Who made the bells? Where is the metallurgy? Who engaged in metallurgy? We've got also, historically, we've got any number of coastal worship patterns and coastal music. Where is this being mapped? This is as much part of the maritime world as the technology and the engagement with the seas. Not to deny, like I said before, the importance of the technological and the technical interventions into understanding the spaces. But the spaces have first a human content. That human content is cultural, spatial, economic, social. All of this needs to be understood, put in place in order to be able to understand how, where, when, what. That is, to me, the true heritage. So we need to go into knowledge, reclaiming knowledge, not knowledge which is, well, sorry to be rude, but the WhatsApp university variety of knowledge, which gives a lots of loud, high-sounding phrases without any content whatsoever. I'm not talking about that kind of knowledge. I'm talking about engaging at multiple levels, multiple generations. Generations have seen changes. What changes? What have they identified as a change? And not to do with just a throwaway phrase, nahi, zamana badal gaya hai. Okay, fine, it has to change. It better change, otherwise there's something wrong with the zamana if it does not change. But beyond that, what precisely has changed? If there is change, the identification of change is also located in continuity. Where is the continuity? What are the areas in which the community see continuity? Have the winds changed? To some extent, yes. Have the monsoon winds changed? Again, to some extent, maybe. How do the fisherfolk understand the ways in which the wind blows? How have they mapped the changes in wind or current direction because of A, sedimentation, because of B, pollution, or any kinds of environmental change? Have things happened? At a primary level, how are they engaging with these changes? And not in terms of conflict, in terms of engaging with the oceans. This is equally applicable to the rivers. We don't have ferries any longer, we have bridges. What has happened to the rivers as a result of bridges? What, in fact, the arguments that were made during the presentation on sedimentation were some of the most important, I think, that have been done. What happens with sedimentation at the bridges? What happens to the underwater life at the bridges? Have we studied that? What is the impact of traffic movement, whether vehicular or train, on these bridges, on the underwater acoustic systems? What is the impact of the constant movement itself on people because or on the underwater domain? All of these need to be understood, approached, and studied. I think I'll stop my presentation there. That's all from my side. Thank you.